She will not
Welcome, everybody, to this Kellogg College 2010 Bynum Tudor lecture. Welcome particularly to this Sheldonian Theatre, this magnificent extension to Kellogg College. Kellogg College is, of course, absolutely delighted to have the Archbishop Desmond Tutu as our Bynum Tudor Fellow this year. After he's given his lecture, the Chancellor of the University will officially give a vote of thanks, and at this time I hope be able to take one or two questions. We are pressed for time, though, because this Sheldonian Theatre is being used for a concert this evening. So once the Chancellor has finished his remarks, can I ask people, please, to make their way out of the Sheldonian Theatre without too much delay. So there won't be time for me to thank either of the speakers after they have spoken. So I just want to thank the Chancellor in advance and anyone who's read his recent book, What Next? An analysis of the global challenges facing us, from climate change to the drugs trade, corruption around the world, will know that we couldn't have had a wiser or better qualified person to respond to the Archbishop's remarks. Now, I know that the standard procedure for me now would be to say that our speaker, the Archbishop, literally needs no introduction, and then to proceed to introduce him. So rather than do that, I thought I'd tell just one very brief story by lieu of an introduction, which is to describe the moment when I became completely convinced that Nelson Mandela would not die in an apartheid prison cell. I'd campaigned against apartheid since the age of 16, and I'm always absurdly optimistic about everything. But during the 1970s and early 1980s, I, like many people, thought the apartheid regime had made the decision that Mandela would never be released, that he would die in a prison cell on Robben Island. And ironically, the moment that dispersed that defeatism for me, and I'm sure a lot of other people, was at the grimmest time of the apartheid regime in the 1980s, when the apartheid police were regularly opening fire on their own civilians, and at the funerals, the demonstrations against the apartheid regime would unleash more violence in another round of funerals and a seemingly endless cycle of violence and death. And almost the only face we from the outside world saw of the majority views in South Africa were the archbishops, usually at these funerals. And I remember one of them vividly, where the BBC reporter asked the archbishop, would he be prepared to become the president of a post-apartheid South Africa? And I, along with the rest of the world, I'm sure, hoped and expected that he would say yes, he would rise to that challenge. And instead, he laughed at the BBC reporter in a way a school teacher might at a pupil who had misunderstood not just the question, but the whole lesson and probably the entire syllabus. And the Archbishop laughed and said, no, Nelson Mandela will be our president. And that's the moment I knew that Nelson Mandela, provided the international pressure was maintained as well as domestically, would be released and would become president of a post-apartheid South Africa. And of course, the Archbishop was absolutely instrumental in making sure that international pressure as well as domestic pressure was maintained to see the downfall of apartheid, and then played a major role in the construction of the new South Africa, chairing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and now plays a very similar role globally as chairman of the elders, bringing together some of the key figures internationally to try to solve the world's trickiest problems. So it really is a fantastic pleasure to introduce the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Your Grace.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Mr. Chancellor, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is a very, very great privilege to have been invited to be, for a while, a fellow of this young, not upstart, this young, vibrant, and innovative college. I've told the story about, he does not need to be, introduced. I was in San Francisco on one occasion, and a lady came up to me, and she was quite effusive and warm, and said, "Hello, Archbishop Mandela." Sort of getting two for the price of one. But it is wonderful to be back here, and congratulations to those of the students who are graduating. I gather that at one time, when people hadn't done too well, they said, yeah, you had got a Desmond or something. I hope, that there aren't too many who will have done that. You ought to get an upper or a first. Kellogg College, as I was saying, is a college that, in my view, is sort of punching above its weight in the contributions it is making to our world, a world bruised and hurting, as much as we know it is, from ills largely of our making. And I want to mention especially the newly established Center for Governance and Transparency, that this is going to be a division of the college that is going to be making a considerable impact and feeling a significant hiatus in our public life. Perhaps a little more about this anon. Then the college does have what I've experienced very briefly as a vibrant human rights department, and one could go on and on and on. And in short, it is really an outstanding college. What are the lessons we can learn from truth commissions which have relevance for our common life? You may be aware that many quite sober students of South African affairs in the bad old days had been making quite dire predictions about what would happen in South Africa as a result of the vicious system of apartheid, when a small white minority was riding roughshod over the huge black majority of that country's population. you know, of course. We were being talked about, laws were made that affected our well-being. But we had absolutely no say in the decisions that did affect us. I was an Archbishop, a Nobel laureate. I was well into my 50s, and yet in the land of my birth, I did not have a vote, whereas a white child of 18 years, thoroughly wet behind her ears, enjoyed the franchise. When I became Archbishop in 1986, it was a criminal offense for my wife and me and our family to live in Bishop's Court because of the Group Areas Act, which designated certain areas as available for only one particular racial group. There were white areas, there were black areas. At that time, I told the South African government that, look here, I am the Archbishop. This is the Archbishop's official residence. My family and I are going to live in the Archbishop's residence. I am not asking for your permission. You can do whatever you want. Fortunately, they did nothing. And they had a wonderful mathematics, arithmetic, as it were. Blacks formed 80% of the population, and they were allocated only 13% of the land. The whites were about 20% of the population, and they hogged 87% of the land. And then they were quite extraordinary in many ways. They decided, that, the black population doesn't form a cohesive group. We really are a nation of minorities. So they wonderfully, by fiat, declared that, the Zulu part of the black population were a separate nation, and so on and so on. But what was even bizarre by their own standards was to declare that the Xhosa group didn't form one nation. They formed two separate nations. And the white community swallowed all of this tosh. And even the West, because the West kept saying these were the last bastion of Western civilization against the depredations of a rampant Soviet communist expansionism. And you knew, that in the white community, which itself was not homogeneous, you had, if their logic were to have been taken to the last extent, then you would have had Afrikaners forming one nation and being given a particular area of their own, the English, the French, the Germans, the Portuguese. No. They, by some strange alchemy, somehow managed to cohere into one nation. And yeah, I mean, they really believed that they had, well, they didn't need to convince us. But I mean, you wanted to have them at least to have tried to make a show of trying to make this thing look reasonable. But you know what? A cabinet minister famously said, well, you know, these blacks, they are slow thinkers. We were slow thinkers. We really couldn't have thought that this was utterly ridiculous. And you know that at one time they didn't let me travel on a South African passport. And so I was given a travel document. And in the space designed for nationality, you won't believe it, but they solemnly put into that space undeterminable at present. Undeterminable at present by people who came from Europe. My forebears and all of those had been born and bred in South Africa. And you know, fairly recently, they decided, some people decided that they were going to have my genome, whatever it is that you do to them, sequenced. And they've discovered that through my mother, I'm in fact descended from the San people, who are the earliest inhabitants of South Africa. A long time afterwards, when we'd been trying to get a meeting with President Reagan, because we wanted to say to him that his policy of constructive engagement was disastrous for us. And we hadn't succeeded in getting an appointment to the White House. Well, of course, I mean, you know, the Nobel Peace Prize does do some extraordinary things, opens all kinds of doors. And we got an invitation to the White House, and we said we were sitting with President Reagan and his cabinet. My wife sat directly opposite him, and I was doing my usual spiel like I'm doing now. And she says that during most of what I was saying, he was quite uninterested, really, until I spoke about having a nationality that was undeterminable at present. She says, even he blanched, and it sort of maybe began to hit him between the eyes. And I mean, it was an incredible thing. You know, how do you divide people into different racial groups, ethnic groups? Scientists find it not too easy to describe race. Well, at home, they had a law, the law of race classification. And they had extraordinarily crude methods that they used. They could come and run a comb through your hair. If the comb caught in your hair, then you're a Bantu, you're a native. If the comb ran reasonably smoothly through your hair, then you were a colored in the terminology that was used in South Africa. And you know, it was, in many ways, yes, it was utterly ridiculous, except that people sometimes committed suicide because they had been classified and put in what they would have considered a lower group. We were the lowest group. And you know, I mean, the kind of thing that they did at election time in order to stampede whites to vote for them. They had this wonderful thing of showing a picture of an unkempt black, and then they would say, do you want your daughter to marry this man? Well, blacks had their comeback, you know, and said, show us your daughter first. And I mean, I am in a way reviewing things that many of you know about, but it is to say that is where we were, that is where we come from. When you think, I mean, that if you had a black injured, say, in a road accident, and time was of the essence to get this person to hospital quickly, and an ambulance designated for whites only arrived, it would leave them here, it would leave them there. And even if, well, he succumbed, tough luck. We had to laugh in order not to cry. But they had road signs where drive carefully. Natives cross here, and you, I mean, some of you would probably know that WAGs in the ANC and all that changed some of these so that they read drive carefully, natives very cross here. Our people tried to use nonviolent means, seeking to persuade their white overlords that they too had a place in the sun, in the land of their birth. You know that our movement was severely restricted by the past laws. And one of the wonderful things about coming to England for the first time, I came in 1962 with my wife, and we would walk in the London streets, and your bobbies at the time were not even armed. And the sense of relief, the sense of just being, hey, you are a person, you are a human being. To meet a London Bobby, and you go up to him, say, excuse me, could you direct me? And then you say, yes, sir, and he, yes, ma'am. So Leah and I would quite frequently accost a Bobby, even if we knew where we were going, just for this novelty. This, hey, you really are a human being. And you know, I mean, that we then had this peaceful demonstration at Sharpeville in 1960 March, when 69 people were shot, most of them in the back. And that was when most of our political organizations, the ANC, the PAC, and the Communist Party, when they were banned, decided to go underground, go into exile. That's when they decided that, well, using non-violent means has been futile. It's brought no results, and that was when they adopted the armed struggle. Our dignity and humanity were carelessly trodden underfoot. And our leaders were saying, I mean, very simple things. You know, we are human. I had not known, because I had very little interaction with whites as being in situations where, I mean, I would be humiliated and so forth. But it's extraordinary just how pervasive this thing can be. We were living in London. I was working for the World Council of Churches in something called the Theological Education Fund. And I used to travel. I had area responsibility for sub-Saharan Africa. And my very first visit to Nigeria, we were to fly to Jos in the north, and I get into the domestic flight, and looking in the cockpit, two pilots, and hey man, I grew inches, and we had a smooth takeoff. And it was so exhilarating. And then we hit the mother and father of turbulence. I cannot believe that the first thought that came to me as we were going all over the place was to say, will these blacks be able to lend us? Now, when we say a system is not just evil, when we say a system is blasphemous, it is when it can make a child of God doubt that they are a child of God. And so all we were saying to them is, we are human. And sort of to paraphrase Shylock, to say, when you tickle us, don't we laugh? When you cut us, don't we bleed? Yeah, you probably did, but you are different. So it is circumstances such as this that made so many students of the South African situation aware that no, it's not going to be possible for there to be a peaceful resolution. This is something that is through and through intractable. And they predicted, many of them, that the only way that this tragedy would have its denouement was in a ghastly racial bloodbath. And actually, when after Nelson Mandela was released, during the period of the negotiations for a settlement, when violence actually did seem endemic. I mean, we had massacres that did seem to have been engineered by a sinister third force. We had random shootings on our trains and drive-past shootings at bus stops and yeah, it was as if those predictions were now sadly being fulfilled. There's a lovely little story of a guy who was driving his car up a mountain road, and he came to grief, and the car spun and went right down to the bottom. And he managed to grab a flimsy twig and was hanging between heaven and perdition with rocks down there. And he said, "Help! Is there anyone up there?" "Yes, my son. Do you trust me?" "Yes." "Then let go of the twig." And I will catch you before you get to the bottom. Silence. "Help! Is there anyone else up there?" Well, many times we wondered whether there was anyone else up there. We thought, that it was curtains for us. The Armageddon was upon us. And then the world watched with almost awe on that incredible day, like no other day ever, April the 27th, 1994, when those long lines of South Africans of all races stood snaking their way into the booth. It was, dear friends, it was an incredible moment. That we could have accomplished a reasonably peaceful transition from injustice and oppression to freedom and democracy. The ghastly racial bloodbath had not happened. And what had seemed to be so utterly intractable, wow, it had been resolved. I've often said that what happened in South Africa then, in a way, sort of paradoxically, South Africa becoming a beacon of hope, that if it could happen as it had happened in South Africa, then there was no reason whatsoever for it not to happen anywhere else. That because it happened in South Africa, we could say in banner headlines, no longer anywhere in the world can we say the situation is intractable. The most difficult situation is capable of resolution. And may I interpose a minute little parenthesis here. We won that freedom, but it is a freedom that we would not have accomplished without the help of the international community. And students were fantastic as part of this anti-apartheid movement. And you have entered into their legacy. So in a real sense, in thanking you, I am thanking those who were your predecessors, who had this incredible idealism that has been such a key characteristic of young people most times. And so, dear friends, thank you on behalf of millions of my compatriots. Thank you for the outstanding, remarkable help you gave when you supported our call for sanctions, for boycotts, and things of that kind. Can I clap you? But I would ask that you join me in case somebody said, we always thought there was a screw loose in that guy's head. Please, I'm clapping you. And I know that you are incredibly, the British. I used to go to Lord's, and Chet Dexter would execute exquisite cover drive. And the British, well played. Until the West Indians came along and were boisterous. Now, no, you've caught on and you beat us the other day. But yes, let's. Can you join me in clapping you? Eh? I don't actually think that is enthusiastic. So I discovered that I had a magic wand. I'm taking it out now. And only the wise can see it. It's got this remarkable power. When I wave it over people, it turns them into instant South Africans. So I wave it over you, and I say, fellow South Africans, let's give these Brits a real... Now, come on. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was more like it. Yeah, oh yes. I wave it and you revert to your... So yes, it was to say no situation ever again can be declared intractable. Well, is that merely a whistling in the dark? For many a decade, Northern Ireland has been plagued by what they call over there the Troubles. And then, a Good Friday Agreement happens. And how many of us ever thought we would live to see the day that an Ian Paisley would be seen on television laughing and joking with a McGuinness? Hadn't we at some point said, no, we think this is intractable? Ha. If those who are at Draggers Drawn could step back and take a deep breath, their situation can in fact ultimately be resolved. Haven't we heard so frequently that we learn from history that we don't learn from history? And what is the lesson we can draw from previous conflicts? It is that in the end, those who have thought a solution can be found only at the end of the barrel of a gun, discover that actually they will have to sit down and parley with their opponents. But why, oh why, with all the many examples to hand, do we seem so hell-bent to engage in something as awful as armed conflict? In South Africa, we had many opportunities when we could have found a negotiated settlement. Yes, I know that those who have power very rarely want to engage voluntarily in a process that means a reduction in their power, in their privilege. Yes. When will we ever learn? Those who have power almost always think they can cling. I'm not speaking about anything around here. Think they can cling to that power and privilege until the cows come home. And when they are shown all the precedents that indicate that you cannot oppress a people forever, then they think they are different. You know, like most of us drivers, when you see the hulks of cars that have come to grief, almost always reckon that accidents are things that happen to other people. The people in Ulster could have had an accommodation akin to the Good Friday Agreement without all the misery and the bloodshed that have preceded that agreement. Are we so programmed, wired in that fashion that peace is possible only after strife? Why don't we accept that Georgia is ultimately a great deal better than war? Can anyone tell me one benefit that has accrued from the immoral invasion of Iraq. One day in the Middle East, they will come to acknowledge that yes, it really was better to have sat down to negotiate and not to engage in a brinkmanship that has played such havoc with Israeli, but especially with Palestinian lives. One day, they will acknowledge that no situation is intractable. What happened in South Africa is proof positive that the best kind of security does not come from the barrel of a gun. No, it comes when the inalienable rights of all are recognized and respected. Israel is entitled to acknowledgement of her borders as a sovereign state, the pre-1967 borders, and she is entitled to security. Thus, Hamas, or whoever fires rockets at civilian targets, is guilty of contravening grossly international law that forbids military targeting civilians. Israel is guilty of gross violations of international law in targeting the civilian population and in the unconscionable blockade of Gaza, subjecting over 1 million people to collective punishment. She's guilty in constructing settlements on Palestinian land. The International Court of Justice has declared the wall Israel has constructed and is still constructing illegal. Israel is able to thumb her nose at the international community because the West feels so guilty and ashamed of its conduct during the Holocaust, and that is as it should be. But the remorseful, the penitent West is not paying the penance, as should be the case. That price is being paid by the Palestinians, and that is not right. And the consequence is that we have the fraught relationship between the West and the Muslim world. And that relationship is not, it's not a kind of prediction I like making, but it is a relationship that is not going to be mended and improved until the question of Israel and Palestine is resolved. You can talk until you are blue in the face about nuclear disarmament, but do we really believe that Israel's neighbors would want to observe nuclear agreements when Israel has been given the opportunity? The security of the world depends on the resolution of this major confrontation in the Middle East. It can happen. It will happen. Israeli, Arab, Muslim neighbors must Israel's Arab and Muslim neighbors must reiterate their recognition and acceptance of Israel as a sovereign state in the Middle East. But what is happening to the Palestinians is the worst possible thing if you want to end the so-called anti-Semitism. One day, the Israelis and the Palestinians will ask, why were we so blind, so stupid for so long? Just as we in South Africa asked, why were we so stupid, so blind for so long. Truth commissions demonstrate that we inhabit a moral universe. Right and wrong matter. Justice and injustice matter. And wonderfully, the perpetrators of injustice and oppression are not God. They may seem at one time to be invincible as they strut the stage of the world, but whoopee, they will come a cropper. They will bite the dust and do so comprehensively. Yes, sometimes they continue to sow their mayhem for an unconscionably long time for those at the receiving end of it. But they will get their comeuppance as sure as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, Franco, Amin, Marcos, Savimbi, Mobutu, Milosevic, the apartheid rulers, where are they? They have become the flotsam and jetsam of history. We used to say to our people at home, those people have already lost, despite their military, their police power. They've already lost. And we would turn to the whites and say to them, we are being nice to you. We are inviting you. Join the winning side. Join the winning side. Truth commissions reveal too that you and I are capable of the most ghastly atrocities. Those who were perpetrators in South Africa, those who supported Hitler, are not people with horns. And if you look carefully, you'll see their tail. They were ordinary human beings like you and me. They went to church. They were decent members of their community, it was thought. And so you and I can't ever be hoity-toity. You and I can but say, there, but for the grace of God, go I. For I don't know, I couldn't predict that if I had been subjected to the same conditions as these people, I wouldn't turn out the same. Truth commissions also wonderfully demonstrate that, you know what? Yes, these atrocities are ghastly. These perpetrators can be awful guys. But it isn't the end of the story. It isn't even the whole story. It isn't even the most important part of the story. The important part is, hey, we human beings can be extraordinarily magnanimous. Frequently in the TRC, I would say, when someone who by rights should have been bristling with hatred and anger, but we're ready actually even to embrace in public someone who had done the most abominable things. I would say, let us keep quiet. Let us keep quiet. For we are in the presence of something holy. We really ought to take off our shoes, for we are standing on holy ground. We human beings are fantastic things. We are made we are made ultimately, isn't it incredible that we, finite creatures, can be those who are made for the infinite, for the transcendent. We. I finish. I notice the chair is getting to fidget a little. I have several little things that I could have said, but I'm not going to say. I'm just going to say, at home, we have something called Ubuntu. Ubuntu, the essence of being human. And we say Ubuntu, when I say Unobuntu, it's the highest accolade I could ever give you. Because Ubuntu says there is nothing like an isolated single individual. Ubuntu says, I am because you are. Well, that's why God said to Adam, it's not good for this guy to be alone. That he needed the other, so that we make up what is lacking in each other's gifting. It's fantastic. I mean, it is to say, I can't exist on my own. You know, I couldn't know how to be a human being. I couldn't know how to speak. I wouldn't know how to think as a human being, except learning from other human beings. And so we are bound in what the Bible calls the bundle of life. If you want another figure, it's that we are family. And if we are family, dear friends, how, in the name of everything that is good, could we ever justify spending, as we do, obscene amounts in what we call defense budget? And we know that a small fraction of those would ensure that children everywhere would have clean water to drink, would afford the cheap inoculations that would enable them not to be infected by disease, that they could have a decent home, that they would have enough food to eat, that they would have a good education and affordable health care. These are members of our family. And you young people are fantastic in your idealism. I say, don't allow yourselves to be infected by our cynicisms. Go out and say, yes, we are going to make poverty history. Yes, we are going out to say, for goodness sake, behave better. All we have is this fragile earth home. And how can we be indifferent to emissions that are so destructive? And go forth and say, for goodness sake, beat your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks. It is possible. So say young people, not exclusively, but mainly. They say it is possible for us to live amicably together. Martin Luther King said, unless we learn to live together as brothers, and we will add sisters, then we are going to perish together as fools. Thank you very much. Thank you.
The Archbishop Mandela, has very kindly said he'd answer a couple of questions, but perhaps they could be questions rather than sermons. Yes, I don't think we've got a microphone, but I will try to shout your question. Provided I hear it, everybody else should be able to hear it.
How many times have you said that to Robert Mugabe? And why hasn't he reacted as we've reacted?
I think you heard the question.
Do you know, sometimes one gets upset with God, you know, and you say, God, why did you give everybody free will? You should have given it to only a few like me, kind of thing. It's that we really have an incredible God. You know, God is omnipotent, we say, but God is impotent as well. God watched as his children put babies into gas chambers. God, the omnipotent, waiting for fellow workers. Because God has given us an incredible gift, and God is not going to nullify it, the gift of freedom. It's an incredible, it's a frightening gift, because it is a gift that says, I can become an angel and I can become a demon. And God says, yeah, God says we wait like God waited for when apartheid would end. Because there were moments when I think many of us would say, why doesn't God send a lightning bolt? Just zap them and zip, zap, zap, and it's all over. No. That's the God we worship. And I'm afraid there's no other, it seems, in the marketplace.
Thank you, Madam, for the excellent, very excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Now, can you share with us the secret philosophy of total forgiveness from what you have gone through?
I'm just thinking about those of us who are married. We know when you have to come back, sort of crawling and do you know, saying sorry in any language is one of the most difficult things. And we used to say, when people got upset that the perpetrators of apartheid got off rather cheaply, that is, they had to come and confess and they got amnesty. And people said, cheap. I said, have you ever had to say to your wife, darling, I'm sorry, in the privacy of your bedroom, with nobody present except you two? These people have to say all of that under the glare of television lights. Can we imagine what it must mean? Yes, I'm laughing a little bit because my wife has put a bumper sticker in a very prominent place, and it says, "You are entitled to your wrong opinion." Yes. I thought you said two questions.
Yes, that's two. That's fine.
Two.
Yeah.
Yeah, two is 1, 2.
Quite. I was asked by the President to respond to the Archbishop's remarks, but I'm sufficiently aware of the notion of anticlimax to keep what I say to a bare minimum. And I just want to say a word about magnanimity, which the Archbishop referred to. Magnanimity, great-souled. It's a wonderful painting by Velázquez called The Surrender of Breda, which I think is probably the greatest pictorial representation of magnanimity. It shows the Spanish commander of troops in the Netherlands, actually an Italian called Spinola, accepting the keys of the city of Breda from the surrendering commandant of the city, who is trying to kneel in front of Spinola. Many of you will know the painting. And Spinola is trying to pull him to his feet to stop him surrendering in that abject fashion. I think it's very easy to tell other people to be magnanimous. Much more difficult, as the Archbishop said, to be magnanimous oneself. I chaired a few years ago a commission which reorganized policing and security services in Northern Ireland. And as part of the process after the Good Friday Agreement, we held a series of public meetings around Northern Ireland, 40 in all, the most difficult public events that I've ever been a party to, which became in a way a sort of truth and reconciliation commission. When people from both communities, and both communities had a legitimate roar of outrage and grievance, would come out and tell us about some of the horrors which had been perpetrated on them or their families. I remember one night in a little fishing village in the lee of the Mourns. We were having a meeting in the local cinema, which was very much like that cinema in the great Italian film Cinema Paradiso. And at the end of a rather difficult meeting of a couple of hours, I got up to make my, by then rather familiar little speech about the importance, now the troubles appeared to be behind us, of generosity of spirit, of healing, of kindness from all sides, and started to move off the stage thinking of the whiskey that awaited me at Hillsborough. And before I could get very far, a little old lady at the back stood up and said, Mr. Patton, before you go, just one question. So I sat down for her question, and she said, it's all very well, she said, for you to come over here and make those pretty speeches about reconciliation and magnanimity. She said, and she leant forward and touched a young man 2 rows in front of her on the shoulder, and she said, it's all very well for you to say these things, Mr. Patton, but this man here killed my son. And it was true. So I think we need to remember sometimes that truth and reconciliation, that magnanimity involved the most extraordinary generosity on behalf of individuals who'll never forget, but have to put that behind them when they remember. Louis MacNeice's father was the Bishop of Down and Connor, was a very, very great preacher. And during an earlier series of ethnic conflicts in Northern Ireland, he gave a wonderful sermon in which he took as his text the line from the Old Testament, remember the past, the better to forget it. And that, I think, it's the best argument for being a historian, which is, after all, a very subversive subject. It's the best, I think, argument for truth and reconciliation commissions, remembering what happened, the better to avoid it happening again. I hope that that's how we'll deal with some of the awful consequences of the politics of identity, racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. I hope that we'll recognize that things can get better. I was at a conference this weekend listening to Tom Foley, the former Speaker of the American House of Representatives, talking with great emotion about his sentiments when President Obama was elected. You may remember the story of Vice President Nixon, as he then was, attending the independence celebrations in Ghana and going up to one black couple and saying, what does it feel like now, he said, to be able to speak freely and vote in an election? And the husband of the couple said, I'm afraid we don't know, we come from Alabama. Well, I think for many Americans, like Tom Foley, like Colin Powell and others, the election of President Obama did show that all things can be well, and all manner of things can be well, but that's based on the bravery and courage of individual men and women, like our lecturer today. This is a great theatre, as you know, built, he didn't realize it at the time, by Christopher Wren as an adjunct to Kellogg. And there have been many speeches down the years about human rights and social justice, but I don't think there has been a greater champion of those things than the man we heard today. So thank you, Archbishop, for coming.